As a 15-year-old girl, I often felt sidelined in my family. My sense of invisibility is especially acute against the background of my younger brother William, who is 14 years old. He was adopted about 9 years ago, and from the very first days, he seemed to fit seamlessly into our family picture. This feeling is reinforced by the fact that my parents even humorously notice how much more similar he is to them, both in appearance and in character, unwittingly giving the impression that he has become an ideal child for them. Their jokes, which may have been intended as harmless, sound sharp and painful to me, making me feel like a stranger among my own. Our family looks really similar to those who could decorate the covers of glossy magazines embodying traditional standards of beauty and the ideal of family happiness. However, I often feel like I don't fit that image. I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes as a child, and since then, managing my weight has become a constant problem. My parents strictly control my diet, and it sometimes reached the point of absurdity. I had to eat secretly to avoid their vigilant supervision, which was more like imprisonment. But as if these difficulties weren't enough, about 5 months ago I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia. This illness became another ordeal for me, forcing me to be periodically confined to a wheelchair due to excruciating pain and weakness. Adaptation to the new state turned out to be difficult not only physically, but also mentally. Being an introvert, I now spend even more time in my room, trying not to be a burden to anyone close to me. Deep down, I feel incredibly lonely, but I've already gotten used to the fact that I can't count on special care or attention. Nevertheless, despite all this, I tried not to refuse to participate in family traditions. One of these customs was the annual Christmas photo, in which our whole family gathered together. It was something that created the illusion of normality and unity. However, this year everything did not go at all as I expected. When I was preparing to join the shoot, I was suddenly asked not to participate. My parents, clearly uncomfortable, explained that a wheelchair would ruin the photo, disrupt the overall style and aesthetics of the picture. I offered to stand for a few frames to avoid unnecessary inconvenience, but they refused, making it clear that they generally did not want my participation. Despite their harsh words, I had to come to terms with the fact that their acceptance was conditional and unlikely to ever change. My grandmother, on the contrary, has always been for me that beacon of strength and inspiration that I aspired to when the world around me seemed especially cold. Her unconditional love was in stark contrast to what I felt from my parents, whose attitude towards me always felt like something temporary, changeable, depending on their mood or circumstances. For a long time, I cherished a faint hope that someday their behavior would change, that they would finally see in me not just a child with problems, but their daughter, deserving of love and respect. But the Christmas incident was a stark reminder that this day may never come. Every time my grandmother suggested that I move in with her, I hesitated. Deep down, I clung to the illusory hope of family recognition, that one day my parents would realize their mistakes and change their attitude towards me. However, the day I was rejected in a family photo, I finally realized the severity of this illusion. My presence in my own house was simply tolerated. I was an unwanted guest in it, who was politely ignored, but never really invited into the circle of warmth and affection. The pain of being excluded from my own family was deep and unbearable, but, as always, my grandmother was there. During our phone conversation, when I broke down crying and shared my pain with her, she listened with the same unshakable fortitude with which she always perceived all my experiences. Her words of comfort were a lifeline for me in this chaos. She assured me that as soon as she returned from her trip, she was on a cruise, enjoying another adventure. She would immediately come for me and take me to her place. My grandmother always lived an adventurous life, surrounded by friends and laughter. Her house was always filled with joy, which was in stark contrast to my current existence, enclosed in the walls of my room, where I felt lonely. Before her arrival, the house was filled with silence, so dense that it seemed you could hear the old boards cracking under the weight of unspoken words. I did my daily chores automatically, school, a little socializing with classmates, then returning to my secluded fortress. My parents and William seemed to act as if nothing had happened, masking the tension that was evident in everything under this appearance of normality. When my grandmother finally arrived, I was the first to meet her on the doorstep. My heart was pounding with excitement and fear that her arrival would change something, finally lead to the change I had dreamed of for so long. My parents greeted her, as usual, with the usual politeness, unaware that she already knew about what happened in the family photo. When she spoke about it with the directness unique to her, I saw the confusion on my parents' faces. They couldn't figure out how she knew, but they soon figured out that I had told her what had happened. Instead of apologizing or trying to fix the situation, they started making excuses again. The same words as back then. They didn't want me to stand or feel uncomfortable with my wheelchair being visible in the photo. That was the last straw. I couldn't keep quiet anymore. Breaking into a scream, I expressed everything that had been accumulating inside me for so long. I turned not only to them, but also to my grandmother, knowing that she would support me. Their excuses were just a cover for their real discomfort. They just didn't want me around because my disability reminded them that their ideal family was far from perfect. I pointed out how unevenly they treated me and William. Although he was adopted, he was accepted as a native, as if he had always been a part of their lives. And I, their biological daughter, always seemed to remain a stranger, superfluous. William looked away, perhaps out of guilt or a reluctant admission of the truth of my words. His silence seemed like a loud confirmation that my feelings were genuine and legitimate. But my parents' reaction was completely different. They instantly went on the defensive, accusing me of being dramatic and spoiled, as if they expected me to apologize for daring to express my resentment and bitterness. To them, my words probably seemed like an exaggeration, but I knew that these were not just emotional outbursts. Their words and actions over the years left deep wounds that were not easy to heal. Every sign of their neglect was like a knife in their heart, and the feeling of belonging to their family was as fragile as it was painful. The presence of my grandmother, her constant support, seemed to give me an inner strength that I did not possess before. She made it clear to me that I deserved more, not just acceptance, but unconditional love and respect, which I had been looking for in my own home for so long, but never found. Together with her, I realized that I could live in a place where I was truly appreciated, where my existence would not be perceived as a burden. Grandma became my refuge, and with her help, I finally felt that there was a place where I could be myself without feeling fear of judgment. When she offered to take me to her place, I felt ready to take this step. I no longer clung to the illusion that my parents would change. Instead, I was ready to leave, and not only the house, but also the conditional love that defined my existence in it. My decision was final, and my grandmother's support gave me confidence that a new beginning awaits me. But before that could happen, we were all caught up in a difficult and intense conversation. During all this time, while I was talking, I couldn't help but notice how my parents' faces were changing. They tried to keep their masks of indifference on, but when Grandma announced that she was taking me with her, their reaction was strikingly insensitive. They didn't even try to hold me back, as if my presence in their house had never mattered much to them. It was a painful moment of truth, confirmation that my worst fears were true. They really didn't want me to be part of their family. The silence that followed Grandma's words seemed deafening. But soon everything changed when she said something that revealed the true nature of my parents. When she announced that she was excluding them from her will, their indifference instantly evaporated, and something akin to panic appeared in their eyes. The mention of the inheritance, which, to be honest, I never really thought about, caused them a surge of emotions. It opened my eyes to how materialistic their true motives are. My grandmother has always been a successful entrepreneur. Her grocery business has flourished, and over the years she has accumulated a considerable fortune. But it never mattered to me. I loved her for the way she was as a person, not for her money or success. However, for my parents, everything turned out to be completely different. Grandma showed them the corrected documents, making it clear that her fortune would now be divided between William and me. I was amazed at how quickly their behavior changed. they began to beg, bargain, trying to regain at least a piece of her favor. But Grandma was adamant. Her eyes, usually soft and benevolent, became cold and determined. She told me to pack my things and be ready to leave. I felt that this moment was long overdue, that it had to happen so that I could finally free myself from the heavy burden that had been weighing on me for so many years. While I was packing my things, my parents continued to rush around helplessly, trying to persuade my grandmother to change her mind. But it was all to no avail. Their pathetic attempts only underlined how shallow their affection for me was. William, the only one who seemed to really want to say goodbye, came up to me when I was ready to leave. There was regret in his eyes, perhaps even the realization of how our parents' behavior had affected him. At that moment, he looked so lost and vulnerable, as if for the first time he realized that our relationship with him had been damaged not only by my resentment, but also by the influence of our parents. One life filled with sincere love and support from my grandmother has become a source of peace and recovery for me. Living with her brought not only emotional stability, but also relief in everyday life. School was now closer, which allowed me to sleep more in the morning and worry less about the little things. Every morning began with a quiet calmness that filled my world, gradually healing the pain that had accumulated over the years. Every new day with my grandmother was like a step forward, towards healing, to feel like part of a family again, where I was really appreciated. An unexpected but important gesture was a message from William shortly after I left. His words were full of regret and sincerity. He apologized for his behavior in the past, admitting that he realized how his actions could hurt me. He expressed gratitude that our family had accepted him and told us how much happier and more confident he had become thanks to the support and love he had received all these years. In this message, I felt William's desire to start all over again, to try to restore our ties, which previously seemed lost to me. We started spending time together at school, and his sincere desire to change gave me hope for the best. These changes in our lives have not been easy. The truth I faced was bitter and painful, but now that I was saying it out loud, it finally set me free. Thanks to my grandmother's support and the rebirth of my relationship with William, I felt that I was finally finding my own family, where I was truly loved and understood. Living with my grandmother was like a fresh breath of air for me, which allowed me to feel that I could live without looking back at the past. The difficult relationship with my parents continued to be difficult, and despite the fact that they always treated William as a full member of the family, their behavior towards me remained a source of tension. Recently, during one of our chance meetings with William, he mentioned something that made me think. We were just chatting as usual, but I couldn't help but ask him what was going on in the house when I wasn't there anymore. His answer was unexpected. He said that there was serious tension between our parents. They, he said, constantly blamed each other for what happened. My mother blamed my father for being the cause of my estrangement. She claimed that his suggestion to exclude me from the Christmas photo was the final straw. My father, in turn, accused my mother of always overreacting to problems, as if my disability was the biggest difficulty she had ever faced. William even casually mentioned that he was worried that their marriage might end in divorce, given how much their quarrels had escalated since my departure. Although his words were spoken casually, they stuck firmly in my head and did not give me any peace. I couldn't get rid of a strange feeling of guilt, as if I was the reason for my parents' possible divorce. It might seem irrational, but the thought that my own heightened perception of the situation could affect their relationship pulled me down. Deep down, I understood that their family problems should not be my responsibility, but it was extremely difficult to get rid of this feeling. Self-blame and regret dragged me into an endless circle of thoughts. I was constantly wondering, what if I just overreacted to that photo incident? What if my parents never intended to offend me, and all this was just a result of their fatigue and stress? But no matter how much I tried to calm myself down, this internal struggle did not subside, and I continued to feel guilty, even knowing that I was responsible for it. All this happened against the background of recent changes related to my grandmother's will. Her decision to leave her entire inheritance to William and me was dictated by the way my parents treated me, but she did not consider William guilty. He was too young and did not participate in the negative behavior that was manifested towards me. Grandma and I both thought William deserved a second chance to make up for the mistakes of the past. William's maternal grandparents were kind people, but they were worried about their daughter's fate. More than once they tried to help her adjust her life so that she could become a good mother to William. However, her struggle with addiction, as well as the inability to keep stable on their feet, made them increasingly think about the boy's future. Eventually, they suggested that she consider adoption when William turned 7. This step was not easy, but they saw in it a chance for a more stable future for their grandson, who, as they understood, could not be realized surrounded by a mother whose life path was full of suffering and difficulties. My parents were already considering adoption at that time. After their first pregnancy ended in complications, they did not want to jeopardize the future of trying to have a child. They knew William's biological mother's cousin from college, and through him they learned about the boy's situation. After several meetings and reflections, they decided to take him into their care, and soon officially adopt him. From that moment on, William became part of our family, and for me he was always a real brother, although our relationship was not always easy. William, despite this, maintained contact with his maternal grandparents. They met monthly, and although these visits sometimes reminded him of his past, they were important to him. However, his biological mother could not bear the pain of losing her son, and has not kept in touch with him since his adoption. Her disappearance from his life was another trauma he had to live with. William's father had also disappeared, and his presence was barely noticeable from the beginning. Understanding all these complex and intertwined family stories has been a difficult process for me. However, frank conversations with William and discussions of these topics helped me to better understand that our family is not only formal ties and blood, but also a deeper relationship full of pain, but also the desire for love. It became clear to me that William, despite all the difficulties, sincerely wanted to be a part of this family and deserved the right to do so. However, when my parents suddenly started apologizing, it seemed insincere to me. Their words sounded more like an attempt to correct their own image than a real realization of their mistakes. I felt that they just wanted to smooth things over before I left for college, so that everything looked safe from the outside, and the real problems that were eating away at our family from the inside remained unresolved. Their apologies were perfunctory, and this was another reminder to me of how difficult it was to achieve real sincerity in our family. I have said rash things about William several times in the past, expressing my disappointment that he was adopted during one of the heated arguments. I regretted it and soon apologized to him because I knew how important he was to me. I never wanted to make him feel like an outsider in our family. Despite our differences, I always saw William as my brother, not only because we grew up together, but also because I really cared about him. Everything that happened between us seemed to me like a test that we had to go through. Now I intend to strengthen our relationship, despite all the shadows of the past that still hung over us because of the behavior of our parents. I'm not going to let these issues come between us again. Moreover, I offered William the opportunity to live with my grandmother and me if the situation at home became unbearable for him. I'm not trying to distance him from his parents, but I want to offer him a safe place where he can feel protected and calm. Recent conversations with my grandmother have also helped me get rid of heavy feelings. When I shared with her my fears that I might be responsible for my parents' strained relationship, she firmly and clearly reminded me that it wasn't my fault. She stressed that my parents had caused their own frustrations, and that their inability to constructively solve their problems was their responsibility, not mine. William also spoke to me frankly and assured me that his words were not intended to make me feel guilty. He just answered my question honestly, and his words helped me feel relieved. Instead of admitting that their actions were inherently offensive, my parents chose careful wording that sidestepped the real issue. I was offended by this, because I expected them to sincerely admit their mistakes. Instead of accepting it, they tried to find explanations that justified their behavior, and it made me feel like they weren't ready for a real dialogue. My first reaction was to invite them to express their thoughts via email or come back another time when I was emotionally ready to talk. I felt that I needed space to think about everything, and I realized that hasty conversations would not lead to solving problems that had been accumulating for years. It may have looked like I was avoiding the discussion, but in fact it was the only way to maintain emotional balance and act on my own terms. After their previous actions left deep wounds, I needed time to come to my senses and sort out my feelings. William supported me in this decision. He understood that I was not ready for hasty conversations that would not bring real changes, and expressed his support for me to handle the situation as I saw fit. He and I promised each other that we wouldn't let our family differences drive a wedge into our bond. No matter how our relationship with our parents developed, our commitment to each other remained unchanged. We would support each other despite all family difficulties. This was an important principle for us, and we decided that our priority was to preserve the trust and love that we were gradually restoring. After several difficult meetings with my parents, I became increasingly convinced that their approach was far from trying to really understand me or admit their mistakes. The last time we tried to talk, I tried to explain that my resentments and frustrations arose in response to their behavior. However, instead of accepting this and trying to make amends, they shifted the focus of the conversation to the fact that my alleged distance and alienation were the cause of our problems. This only reinforced my feeling that they are incapable of sincere apologies, and that their main purpose is to manipulate the situation by making me feel responsible for everything that happened. Feeling growing frustration, I realized that this vicious circle of guilt and accusations would lead to nothing. I asked them to leave when I felt that my strength was running out. However, they refused, insisting that we need to have a full discussion, as if a simple conversation could solve all the ingrained problems between us. It seemed to them that their performance of parental duties gave them the right to such a dialogue, as if they deserved it only because they provided me with basic care in childhood. When I realized that I could no longer continue the conversation without getting even more frustrated, I went to my room. It was at this point that my father tried to escalate the situation by demanding that I stay and continue the conversation. Fortunately, Grandma intervened when she saw that I was on edge. She firmly told her father that raising her voice in her house, especially after the way they had treated me in the past, was unacceptable. Her voice sounded confident, and she made it clear that if I didn't want to continue the conversation, they had to respect my decision. This incident was a revelation for both me and them. He showed me that my parents don't care so much about my well-being as about how our family drama will look in the eyes of others. They were more worried about what people would think if they found out that I had moved in with my grandmother than about how I felt and how I was coping with their actions. When my parents left, my grandmother and I discussed how I wanted to build my relationship with them in the future. At the moment, my answer was a categorical no. I didn't want to see them anytime soon. Grandma supported my decision and promised that next time they would not be able to just come without my consent. This conversation was important to me, as I began to feel in control of my life and realized that I had the right to my space and my future. Later, I discussed my parents' visit with William. He was surprised by their behavior and said that after their return home, the mood was gloomy. Although I felt sorry for him, I understood that I needed to keep my distance for the sake of my mental health.